Bob, and hello everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today for what I think is a really important topic, and just thanks to the Mather team for putting this together for us. So as Bob said, today's webinar is entitled, What's Your Strategy for Digital Users? And if you're like me, this topic is super important because the better our strategy, the greater the opportunity. Digital users and having a solid plan for them ultimately means better subscription growth and better revenue. And like many of you on this WebEx today, I've spent a lot of time trying to figure that out, trying to maximize both of them. I've written about it, I've spoke about it many times, and even though we've been in this space for some time, I feel like there is still much more that we can do. And that's what we're going to talk about today, both methodology, some great examples, and some successes to go with it. So before we jump in, we've got two housekeeping items I just wanted to remind you about. One is, and you know this, your active participation is critical throughout this session. During this presentation, I am in charge of the chat functionality, so if you have a question or a comment, go ahead and type it into the question box throughout the presentation. And I'll read those aloud as they are in the order in which we receive them. If I can fit one in when we're on a particular part of the discussion, I will, but I promise you we'll get all of them in before we're done. And just the second item is, as Bob said, we are recording this presentation, and a copy of that will be available to all of those that have registered. All right, so with that said, I'd like to introduce a couple of people to you today. Arvid is the Director of Product Development at Mather and developed the Listener tool. And Nikhil is the Vice President of Marketing for the Dispatch Media Group and has been a partner with Mather for some time now. So guys, thanks to both of you for putting this together for this session, and welcome.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
And Bob.
All right, so let's talk about some industry challenges. And I think it would be safe to say, if you just look at the platform challenges that we have listed here, that these are shared by all of us. And understanding the differences in audience by platform, especially mobile, and how to engage that audience and monetize them is a challenge. Even sometimes things as basic as determining what the meter settings should be for mobile or desktop can be difficult if you don't know how to use the data properly. Secondly, the fact that many of us use multiple vendors, one to collect data, another to implement the paywall, and still others based on the platform type can be extremely challenging. And when you factor in social media and those users and their relationship, it gets even tougher. And that, I mean, we haven't even got to the revenue part yet, right, Nikhil?
Absolutely. And I think, Jeff, one of the things I'll add to one of the topic that when it comes to multiple vendors, none of them have the same standards, right? So
right.
Integrating data between multiple vendors is sometimes a cluster. So that is one of a huge challenge that we face as an industry. And I think digital subscription and revenue, I'll be remiss if I say that that's probably among the top growth areas that we as an industry have identified for us. I don't know if anybody besides the New York Times, which obviously has a national presence, has the scale of, what is it, 1.5, last I saw 1.5 million plus digital subscribers. I know some of our friends at the Boston Globe and at Cox in Atlanta have some really aggressive goals, including ourselves, as now that Columbus and Dispatch Media Group is part of Gatehouse Media, we have aggressive digital subscription growth goals. But when you talk about regional markets individually, and I can attest to this from Columbus's standpoint, we have about 130,000 print subscribers, but only 6,500 digital-only subscribers, which is roughly about 5% of our print base. I'm assuming that kind of is consistent. I believe as an industry, we are in that between 5 and 10% of our total print base being digital-only subscribers. So that's a huge challenge, because if that's our future, we are not growing fast enough to make up for the losses that we are making on the print side. So if you look at it from a revenue standpoint, again, Columbus specifically, we're talking from a $40 million base in subscription revenue, only $1 million coming out of digital-only subs. I'm assuming, Jeff, you may have a similar story to share on that side.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and you mentioned the industry standard, and that's something, it's really sort of hard to determine a true benchmark, I think, for where you should be when you look at print subscriptions and digital-only subscriptions together. But that 5% to 10% range, I believe, is sort of where everybody's living at, and that's what they're using, as a benchmark for at least understanding the range of where they might be. So I agree, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think the fifth bullet point under digital subscriptions, the improved CPMs with first and third party data. I mean, that's absolutely critical for us. And as we go through the presentation, I know we're going to talk about listener later, and Arvid's going to share some of that. But that's what we as an industry should strive for, is first party data and the ability to understand our users using resources and technologies that we can deploy on our assets, versus relying on third parties who obviously, one, not only take away a rev share from the advertising standpoint, but then we lose control our own user base. So that's another really critical factor. Besides that, I think the other key challenge that we, from an audience development side and search marketing side, have always faced is the not exactly a battle, but almost like a constant conversation with the other revenue side of the operation, which is advertising. And we struggle with getting meters and at the right level, right? Because there's always, I'm going to lose page views, I'm going to lose impressions. And how do we predict what that level is going to be? Typically, we've not seen significant losses on the impression side when meters get deployed. Yes, immediately after meter get deployed, there is a slight dip, but over time, those users come back and their engagement is just high as it has always been. Plus, not to belittle the fact that typically ad sell-through rates on majority of news industry websites have been hovering around that 45 to 55%. So there's significant bandwidth on the upside. Even if we were to lose page views, ad revenue is really not that much at risk. Is that consistent, Jeff, in your world as well?
Absolutely, absolutely. And one of the things that I've always complimented newsrooms and audience teams with is the fact that even when we did make adjustments in meters along the way, that because of just how rapid response they are into developing new things and growing different components in what they can do with our audiences, they've rapidly overcame that. I mean, so yeah, when you put it in, I think that's when the shock was for all of us. But what you saw as we continued to test and adjust those settings, in most cases they were able to overcome that. And that's just from the audience side. Certainly the same on the advertising side and the sell-through rates. I mean, that's a definitely something that needs to be discussed, but in most cases there's plenty of opportunity to learn and to test with very, very low risk. I agree.
And I mean, from an engagement metric standpoint, I think we've kind of touched on pretty much the challenges here being what's the standard that we as an industry need to operate. I think that's still evolving, and hopefully leaders such as yourself, Jeff, and obviously everybody else who is on this call can come together and help establish what those standards should be and what those KPIs should be. So
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the only note I had written myself on that is which metrics matter and what the benchmarks might be for each of them, and just how to use the data that you have to determine that. So I absolutely agree. All righty. So Nikhil, and we've talked about this in preparation for this presentation today, in just managing the digital challenges that we have. And one of the challenges for me, as I said, is just always being able to develop benchmarks for digital. It's difficult, you're right, because there is no standard. There are hard walls, there are meters. There's not even a standard or a best practice for what those meter settings should be for desktop versus mobile versus app versus social and search. I mean, and we're having to make those decisions in a lot of cases without really having the knowledge and the data in front of us to do that. Would you agree with that?
You're absolutely right, Jeff. And I know I shared some of the numbers that we see here in Columbus, right? Well, we have 3 million unique visitors to our website and only 26,000 uniques to our mobile app. But we have 10 million page views on our website compared to 4.5 million page views on the app, which leads to 3 page views per user on the web on average over the course of a month versus 130 odd screen views per users on the mobile app. So where do you set that meter, right?
Right.
I know typically across the industry, I would venture to guess that not a large portion of the industry is still not metering their app. And for the most part, the web meter is somewhere between the 5 and 10 page views range for the most part. I know there are some markets who have 15 plus page views or article views, as some may reference it. And there are some, and like we have up on the slide, there are some real hard paywalls. Gatehouse Media just recently acquired a group here in Ohio, and as we start looking at it, they have an actual hard paywall. So there's a bunch of markets out there who potentially have 0 page views or 0 article views that they allow in its entirety before they ask someone to subscribe or authenticate themselves. So I mean, again, like you said, it's spread so wide, and we just need to figure out what that industry standard needs to be, and maybe it's tiered, maybe it's different sizes based on market size, maybe it's based on the device or platform through which people come in. So we just need to get together and kind of have some. Those are the challenges that we face as an industry.
Well, and like you said earlier, I mean, you're balancing this with your advertising teams and what's their success on desktop versus mobile versus app. So it's complicated. There's no question about that.
Yeah, it's the same old world we live in, right? It's dollars to dimes to probably pennies in terms of the range of dollars that sit in our print versus web versus mobile world. Even now, now we talk about mobile. Obviously, is the next wave, and we definitely need to move in that direction faster and grow faster, and put resources towards mobile development much faster than we as an industry have.
I agree. This is a great slide, by the way. I don't think I had a chance to tell you, and I'm picturing pretty much everybody on the WebEx today like nodding their head simultaneously as they look at this, because the challenges and goals that you have listed are the same for everybody. But just the way you've got this laid out is excellent, and I'm wondering if you couldn't just quickly walk us through each of these categories, if that's okay.
Absolutely, Jeff. And I think we've probably, like you said, we've probably touched on these over the last few minutes. I mean, siloed data, yes, we have multiple data sets sitting on the relationships we have with our subscribers or potentially all the folks in our market. In some cases, those data sets are incomplete, primarily because they come from different sources. And then how do we use and how do we make the connections? How do we match those data points to successfully generate campaigns to go out and acquire subscribers? And more so in the digital setting. How do we connect data that we have offline to someone who's using our digital assets? So that's kind of where we're at again, and paywall settings. Right? I mean, what is the optimum level for the meter? We've tried so many things, and working with Mather, there's data that helps us kind of make some good recommendations. So when we started this conversation, it was, I think, we've been working with Team Mather since 2007, 2008 on pricing and the traditional relationship that most publishers have had. But when we kind of sat down in a strategy session with Matt and Arvid and the team and Bob and everybody and said, here's our goals. I mean, obviously, we need to grow aggressively on the digital side. We need to figure out a metering strategy. It's not just let's put up a 5-page meter and see where it goes from there. And kind of how can we gather intelligence on users who are visiting our sites, how they are behaving, and how can we use that data to help on marketing? And it was almost like light bulbs went off everywhere, right? Because Arvid, I know at that point, was in the process of developing this tool. So like, hey, we may just have the right thing for you. So Arvid, do you want to kind of talk about that conversation and how it evolved and how listeners started fitting in to help us with some of these goals?
Sure. Yeah. So I know we were up in Columbus a few times, and one of the times I think there was here's our problems, and we kind of realized, wait a minute, we actually can help with some of the data problems for sure, and the analytics and recommendations are right in our wheelhouse. So this was actually long before we kind of had all the kind of clear idea of what listener was going to be, but I think Nikhil was critical in kind of helping us really craft what it was. But in short, really skipping down to that last bullet point with the approach on the slide there is essentially kind of, with listener, you're collecting a lot of the right data points, which is essentially for anonymous users, kind of their behavior on the site, and identifying people who are either interested in certain content types or certain authors, what device usage, I mean, the common things you might think of. But I think where really we saw the most critical, or I guess most important piece was where we were able to identify that what we call a known user. And that known user is essentially someone that you have some sort of data where you have something beyond just a cookie or some sort of just device ID. You have truly a kind of a user ID that you can target either repeatedly through email campaigns, through the paywall, or through the ad server. In our approach, I think, and we'll talk more about this, but we actually are hopefully live now with some tests that we're doing with the user segmentation.
And if I may add, I mean, every one of us marketers on this call, the utopia is a single customer view for folks we have relationships with. And what we were able to get to is that single customer view for a bunch of folks that we were able to identify and connect the dots between the print and the digital space. So that was a big win for us.
Right. Yeah, I'll talk more about, for sure, about some of the things that we're doing kind of with Nikhil and examples there. But at a again, really high level, I think the biggest opportunity that we see really for publishers, and I've heard something from several folks, is either described as a user funnel or as subscriber lifecycle management, or whatever the naming is essentially kind of taking someone who is currently anonymous and maybe a very disengaged, maybe they get referred from Facebook once a month, and that's it, and trying to grow that engagement, one. Two, then trying to get them to register or to somehow give their email to you so you can then market to them on that kind of true per person basis. And then once you have them sort of hooked or engaged and you see that they're more of a stable user, then you hit them with the subscription offer. So I think what we saw, and to the point about kind of a standard across the industry, I think the only consistent thing we've seen is that maybe 3, 4, 5 years ago is that people were really starting out with a very high paywall setting, meaning that they allowed maybe 25 or 30 articles per month, and then that kind of started to go down. But the other thing we saw that was consistent across a lot of publishers was that there wasn't really a lot of targeting or nuance. It was sort of a here's one price, here's one offer, and it's applied to everybody no matter who you are, where you are in your engagement. And I think that's really the thing that's been changing lately, where I think the technology's caught up to sort of the thought of let's be very targeted with the tools that publishers have on sites and offline. I think the analytics have always been there, the data's been there, but I think for the first time we're actually seeing sort of the connection of this data to the tools that are fulfilling some of these campaigns. Again, to the point about the metrics, I totally agree. I think a lot of publishers are perhaps still using kind of older methods of measuring success, which is I think typically tied to page views. So if they see that month over month or year over year they had a 10% growth in page views, well, it's great. Maybe your inventory's gone up, maybe you're publishing more content, maybe more people know about you, but is that really the right metric to look at? And for us, I think the things that we focus on are really tied to revenue. It could be revenue tied to conversion, revenue from the ad side, and kind of what are the steps to get to kind of maximize that number. So to us, it's not about maybe growing page views necessarily, but it's about, are you growing the right kind of page views? Are you attracting that right customer or that right audience type who is actually engaged, or is there a way to convert them to be more engaged? So if you get 1 million more visitors to your site, but they're all flybys and they never come back, is that actually worth the effort to get that 1 million? Or do you perhaps focus on the 100,000 users on your site who are in that kind of middle bucket? They're not quite sure if they want to subscribe yet, but they know your brand. So do you perhaps put your resources on that 100,000 because the ROI in the 100,000 is probably much larger than the ROI in that 1 million who are not engaged? So that's kind of our approach to metrics. In terms of real application, we'll talk, I think, some more about what we're doing with Dispatch and a few others, but some of the easy stuff is email campaigns. And I know we were doing this, I think, Nikhil, with you with kind of the cart abandonment emails until I think there were some technology changes. But essentially what that is if a user hits the paywall, they register or they fill in their billing information, but they don't actually hit the complete button, kind of the same way that Amazon or any other retailer might do. We'll actually collect that data, figure out what were they looking at before they hit that paywall, what was the kind of offer they chose before they abandoned their purchase, their checkout phase. And then we actually send that data daily or weekly over to Nikhil and his team, and then they kind of follow up with them through their own campaign tracking.
Yep. The other thing we also had done, Arvid, was the contextual e-newsletter triggers, where based on the content type that the person's viewing on the site, if they're not signed up for the newsletter, there was an email newsletter that went out and said, hey, sign up so you can consistently receive. So that was cool too.
Right. Yeah, and believe it or not, that's kind of the easy stuff. I think where it gets a bit more complex is some of the next thing there, the paywall and ad server. And I think we're there now. I think about a year ago, if you asked me, it was still kind of trying to connect the dots. But I think now we're to a point where we've done a lot of work with the vendors that are common in the industry. So P&O, Synchronex, MPP, MG2, DFP, probably a dozen others, Salesforce, ExactTarget. So we've done a lot of work to try to connect our data into those systems. So it's really, that part is solved. It's more a matter of, kind of the leadership that, Nikhil might provide, where he says, here's what I want to do, and we kind of connect the dots and give him the right data to make it happen. And then lastly, one thing that we emphasize a lot at Mather is sort of this ongoing testing and A/B testing, where we want to make sure it's actually working. So we'll often do, as we do on the print side with home delivery pricing, through the paywall, we'll have an A and B group. One group will get kind of this usual offers and price points and experience, and then the B group will get the other sort of test that we're trying to do. Or maybe it's the other way around, but either way, we're we want to make sure that we can show incremental lift either in conversions or engagement, click through, whatever the metric is. And to us, it's got to be tied to revenue in some way. That's kind of the ongoing consulting recommendations that we do. So to back up a step, so the point that I think Nikhil made about that connecting the dots. So just to kind of as a preamble, the reason we think that this known audience is such an important thing is because if someone's anonymous, as you know, it's essentially all he knows that their cookie, their device, and perhaps their location. But once you get their email address, once you perhaps either serve them up a survey or a contest, or just get them to register in exchange for more page views, or whatever it is, you can then kind of enable all this sort of first-party data that you have in the user. So as an example, here we have this used to be Bob Terzotis actually. I think we tried to anonymize it, but anyway, so some of the data points here are actually not Bob anymore, but this used to be Bob on the slide. But in any case, so this person here, you can see that they're actually a former subscriber because we now connect their email address to their prior account number, at least on the digital side. We can see their web usage, so it's some summary. They're mostly a mobile device user. We can see their behavior. They're basically on the site all day, basically before work, during lunch, and after work. You can see their favorite content, favorite author. If you have a Prism cluster or Mosaic or Experian or any other demographics, I think, Nikhil, you now have, well, I don't want to...
Experian.
Experian, yeah.
We use Experian segment, yeah.
Right, so we can actually connect that to this user, so we can know more about what their actual demographics and psychographics are. If there's other data that you have available, like their publicly available home value or anything else that Nikhil might have in the database, their ad value. So what's really cool is because Listener actually sits in the ad server and on the website, we actually tell precisely from Joe's sample in this case exactly what pages he clicked on, exactly what impressions were delivered to him down to that line item level, and what was the CPM of those line items. So actually for a day or for a month or even for a page, we can tell exactly what were the line items and impressions that were targeted to him, and therefore what is that value that he's generating on the ad side. So that's pretty valuable data, and that's a very important thing for us to consider when we're trying to recommend, what is the meter setting we're trying to set, or what is the best way to kind of optimize the net revenue from this particular person.
I can probably attest to the fact that, when we first started kind of seeing these dots being connected, like Arvid put it, and the results of the entity resolution, I can totally see a whole bunch of eyes on this webinar right now saying, wow, that's awesome. Look at all the triggers I potentially have here to get marketing campaigns out. How can if this kind of information is available for majority of my base, then how can I segment? How can I take it to the next level? What's that? Can we group these kind of behaviors into specific user segments, etc.? I think, Arvid, I know we're going to cover that in the future, but I think that this generates so much conversation and kind of, helps define strategy that it's awesome. So.
Yeah, and just to, and I'll probably might let Nikhil talk about this since this is his slide actually, but one thing we did as well is, as we're kind of, my one point here on the prior slide where we had other data, which is kind of a catch-all, but in that line we actually had, I think, 4 or I guess 5 total systems. So we had DSI, which is now, I guess, part of NewsCycle, ExactTarget, which is now Salesforce, Triton, their loyalty platform, and some other data from their classifieds system as well. So essentially we kind of combined what's called entity resolution, essentially, where we combined all these different platforms to give a much richer profile of the user. So this is all kind of in addition to what you saw on the prior page as well.
Yep. And again, you said it, Arvid. Once you have all those data points connected, the first question I know I asked was, so who's better engaged online, or who's better engaged with our digital content? And again, this is just scratching what you see on the slide is just scratching the surface. it's obvious that digital-only subscribers are highly engaged. They have more page views, they have more visits, but there are nuances about digital-only subscribers versus subscribers who are print-only versus folks who are print and are what we call hybrid subscribers in the industry, and kind of our ability to compare behaviors across those different multiple segments is the true value behind making these connections.
So I'll kind of run through these a little bit quicker just so we can get to some of the results. So at a higher level, just again, what we've been talking about essentially gets put into this sort of matrix or how we approach different segments. So just to kind of set the stage, so as an example, on the top row, you have that known user base, which is, again, we have their email address, maybe some other personally identifiable data on that user. The bottom row is the anonymous, which is, again, pretty straightforward. And in this case, we kind of keep it simple from low to high levels of engagement. Let's not worry about what engagement, how it's actually measured for now, but let's just say low to high. And as you probably expect that, you know, unfortunately for most publishers, that bottom left, that anonymous flyby with low engagement, that's about 3/4 of the users and about 1/3 of the page views in our sort of benchmarking database from about 100 different newspapers that are using Listener. I think the biggest opportunity is probably that middle section, middle or medium engagement level, where you have about 1/4 of your users, 40% of the volume of page views, and that sort of bottom, you know, anonymous medium bucket is where I think there's a lot of opportunity to move people up either to a known user or perhaps to that high anonymous user. So that's where perhaps targeted messaging through the paywall, engagement through any kind of ad campaigns you might run through DFP, contests, surveys, whatever it may be to collect that user ID or email address. That's probably where there's a lot of sort of action happening to get that next step. Looking at that kind of high column at the far right, if they're anonymous, that's where I think you have to almost force the issue. And we'll talk about a test that we're launching or has launched hopefully today or this week at Columbus, where if they're anonymous but they're highly engaged and not a subscriber, we try to force the issue with a subscription offer. Again, in contrast to if they're in the medium engagement bucket and anonymous, in that case, we don't force a subscription offer, but try to get them to just give us some sort of data. And then lastly, kind of the contrast for that high engagement known user, that's where the tactics shift dramatically to more on the retention side. So everywhere else that I think 5 out of these 6 buckets is more about acquisition or growing engagement, I think that far right is more about retention and retaining engagement. So the tactics are very different about how you message them, what kind of newsletters you sign them up for, and how you communicate with them. So that's kind of how we think of the audience. And basically what I just mentioned here. So yeah, I think that middle, medium, anonymous group is where the action is. So in the interest of time, I'll just probably go ahead and move on to some real data for the dispatch group. So in their case, this is 3 of their 6 segments that we just chose to share on the webinar today. So they have, again, this giant flyby section. So as you might expect, it's really kind of a, people who are not engaged and mostly coming from social media. And the goal there is to convert to a repeat visitor. So perhaps that's, messaging them with a, very soft modal that says, hey, here's some more content, or, please come back. But there's really not much you can do other than try to encourage them to repeat or to come back to your site. The middle bucket for them is someone we call stable users. So these are people who are still not very engaged. They're probably underneath the threshold for them to actually hit a paywall, or maybe right at that threshold. So the idea here is, again, to kind of collect that email address as opposed to try to force a subscription offer. And that's about 10% of their users, which is actually a pretty sizable chunk. I think it's about several 100,000 users, so you might be able to convert to a known user. And lastly, we call them fanatics, but essentially the top 2% of their users. And again, the tactics here might be different if you're known versus, or if you're a subscriber versus if you're anonymous. So what's remarkable is that 20% of that 2% are actually already subscribers, or at least they're registered and known, which leaves about 80% where you either need to force the issue with that kind of subscription offer right away.
For a market our size, that 2% represents about 60,000 visitors to our site every month. And when Arvid says we have information for PII data, only 20% of those folks, there's an opportunity with the remaining 80%, which is almost 36,000 users, which probably are just freeloading on a whole bunch of content.
Right. So with that in mind, let's get the results. So, Nikhil, do you want to talk about this? I can do a quick summary, or either way.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. I can jump in there. Yeah.
Sure. So this was essentially what we did was through DFP, we identified an audience group that we thought had a high propensity to convert to a paid subscription. So Nikhil and his team built the creative you see on the left here, $1 Sunday plus digital offer. And what we did is we said, let's take an audience that looks like they're very engaged. I think the threshold is about 6+ articles per month and a few other things. And let's run that side by side with a run of site campaign through DFP. This is, again, kind of what's called a house ad, which is kind of an ad served up on the publisher's own website through DFP. The results are pretty remarkable. That left bar there, that click-through rates, we initially thought that our test was a failure because our click-through rate is about a third of what the click-through rate from the run of site campaign was. So ours was about 0.1%. The run of site was almost 0.3%. But what was remarkable was that the entire user base, even though that perhaps not everyone clicked through it, almost double the people converted to an actual paid subscription from that targeting. So it was, again, to the comment earlier, what's the right metric to look at? To me, click-through rates, it's fine, but to me, it's not the most important one. The most important one is actual conversion to that paid product. And for listener, it can actually track who was served up that impression and who went from that impression to a conversion.
And this test helped us on two fronts, right? One, obviously, how can we, from marketing and audience development side, target our most likely prospects who are visiting our sites? But more importantly, and yes, I don't want to call it more importantly, but just as well, test this ability that we can actually use intelligence on our first, again, I'm coming back to that first party data on our users, on our site, and their behaviors, and how can we take that information, because it's already integrated with DFP and we are able to serve advertising to these uniquely identified target audiences, how can we take that information to an advertising partner, which we'll talk about in the next few minutes.
Hey guys, let me just jump in there real quick if you don't mind, just to those folks out there that might have questions that they want to ask. We've got a couple here, but we're getting to the probably the 40-minute mark, so if you've got one, go ahead and ask it now, and I'll make sure to make room for it at the end. Okay, guys, sorry about that.
No problem, Jim. Thank you. Arvid, so I know I mentioned it earlier, and Arvid also referenced it, but truly what it comes down to is as we started collecting all this great data, I mean, there's millions and millions of rows of records, right? But when we want to bring it all together, we had a strategy session and said, okay, we have all this information, we have all these segments, let's sit down and figure out, what's the right strategy for each of those groups. And what you see on this chart is obviously some of the solution providers that, like Arvid said, integrate already with Listener. So our ability to serve contextually relevant messaging and triggers based on the user segment is really amplified because of the intelligence that we have on the back end. So one of the ways we are deploying that, if you go to the next slide, would be through Piano, which is our new metering technology. We are able to ingest listener segments, and Arvid referenced the Fanatic group. So the Fanatic group is basically going to be the first filter that anybody who comes to our website is going to be checked against. That's the first group right there. Fanatic and enthusiast is what we are calling them. And if they are not, then they go to our normal metering process, which is, hey, at stage 5, we will ping them and say, sign up, give us more information about yourself and we'll give you 5 additional page views, or sign up now for a digital subscription, or authenticate yourself as an existing subscriber. But if we identify those cookies as enthusiasts or fanatics, we pass them through a 2-page. So we are testing 2 things here. One is we are testing a meter level, which is 2. And as we go further down this path, we are also splitting that group 2 ways. 30% of them will get a give me more information template, and 70% of them will get a price point template. At that point, hey, at page 2, I want you to sign up, and I'm going to basically put a more aggressive, or rather higher price point, I would call it $7.99 versus our regular $5.99 offer. So we are testing those 2, meter level and price point. We want to start off, so this kicks off this week. It took us a while to get here, but I know we are all excited to go live with this. And once we start collecting data, we'll start building control groups and use this as a starting point for future further testing. Go ahead, Avi.
Sure. In 1 minute, so this is a pretty cool application on the advertising side, actually. I know we talked about audience for the last really, I think, 40 minutes, but this is actually where we took data from the Columbus Blue Jackets, which is an NHL team who's actually doing really well this year, which is good news for Columbus, I guess. And they gave us data on about 116 or 137,000 total ticket holders, first name, last name, email, phone number, et cetera. And what we did was we matched that against the entire user database of the Columbus Dispatch, so formers and active subscribers. Matched about 21%, which is about 9% of the dispatch side and 16% from the hockey team side. And what they're able to do was, besides kind of give the advertiser a lot of valuable data about prospects within the print side, who are of the same audience, we also found people who are essentially currently not ticket holders, but those who look alike ticket holders. So we actually built a discrete a model that forecasted or predicted who within the dispatch universe looked like they should be a ticket buyer, and give that back to the advertiser in the form of, again, the 42,000 prospects here in the print universe, but also there's about, I think, 100,000 users we saw online who looked like they should be the ticket holders, their listener. So is this, I know I'm kind of waiting as well, is this live now, Nikhil, or is this about to go live as well?
It is live now, and the groups that you see on the left, so the best part about the Jackets is we are partners. So we are able to kind of take any of these new developments, new technologies, and new solutions to them, and they are willing to test. So we are running an A/B test right now on the top prospects. The matched group is getting the generic offer, but the A/B tests are the 2 groups, which are the life stage groups within Experian, which scored the highest based on the statistical modeling that Team Mather did in Orbit's team, and they fit the top prospects profile. And Power Elites are going to get a specific message. Flourishing Families are going to get a specific message triggered. And we're going to test which works better, use that information to kind of start selling season ticket packages for the following season for the Columbus Blue Jackets. And again, 2 things here. Again, I want to reiterate, this is what first-party data, having access to that first-party data allows us to take to an existing advertising partner and leverage more ad dollars. I think we have about $80,000 plus committed from the Columbus Blue Jackets to some of the work that we are doing with them, just purely in the digital space. And second, and more importantly, this is becoming a real differentiator as we talk to more customers locally. The fact that we can leverage this first-party data, which nobody else has been able to do, because, I mean, I know you are all marketers, so digital solutions are becoming a commodity asset, and it's a price war out there. But this helps us create a real differentiator and allow us to continue to charge a premium price for the great content that we are serving these ads around on audiences that we know are highly valuable to our advertisers.
Thank you, Nikhil. Thank you, Arvid. Okay, we got a few minutes left, so I've got to jump into a couple of questions here, and then we'll talk about some takeaways. I have one that says, what is the thought process for presenting a print offer to digital content readers? Nikhil, you want to take a stab at that one?
If somebody hits, so the way it's set up right now, if you're on our website and you hit a meter, they get two options. One, would you like, so like I said, sign up for additional page views, which means we are collecting more information from them. Two, sign up for a digital subscription if you're not already a digital subscriber. Three, authenticate yourself as an existing print subscriber or sign up for a print subscription. And those two pathways take them to two different locations, one within Piano and the other to our standard offer templates. So we are not, we are definitely offering a print subscription template whenever they hit the paywall, depending on their status.
I'll offer too one quick thought. There's nothing wrong with offering, if you're sorting up a little modal that says maybe 2 or 3 offers, because if you've ever read, there's a book called Predictably Irrational. It's like an economist, and essentially no one makes a decision on price without context. So essentially, what helps sometimes is to show that 7-day offer or even a Sunday offer plus digital and a digital-only offer next to each other, so they understand what is the value of your product in its true form, and then
I agree.
Helps them. Yeah. So, and plus the Sunday-only preprint doesn't hurt either. So.
I agree. All right. Well, this could be for either. Arvid, from your side, what is the biggest roadblock to implementing Listener for publishers?
I think I can say from experience, I think the biggest roadblock we often get is just will, and perhaps just sometimes the IT team is very and rightfully so. There's a lot of, I think, weight or things that kind of slow down the user experience on the site. So a common question we always get is, what is the impact on load times or page performance, user experience? So that is usually more of a perception problem for us. But I think once we kind of show, in our testing, we're less than 1% of the actual weight of the page. But I think once we get past that sort of initial, standoffishness with the IT group, I think it's all good. But that's kind of my own experience on the roadblock.
Okay. Cool.
Hey, Jeff, if I may add quickly one little thing. I know we talked about this before the discussion started, but the trick to this is to get those initial small wins rather than going for the big jackpot. Get those small wins, start small, use pilots, test, and prove that the test works, and then you start getting buy-in from not just the IT department, but truly from all the stakeholders that are involved.
I agree. All right, last question we have on the list, and that's one about benchmarks. So Arvid, as you guys add other clients and you start to collect information from the different newspapers or newspaper groups, is there a plan at some point to have a set of guideposts or benchmarks for newspapers to be able to go by?
Actually, there is. I'm glad you asked. We're actually, and I think this is perhaps the first public announcement that I'm aware of, but we are going to be debuting a digital benchmarking tool at the Media Exchange Conference in New Orleans late next month. So what we've done is essentially working with the NMA, News Media Alliance. We've actually partnered with them to build a dashboard that shows kind of each site's own KPIs on digital metrics, and shows kind of the industry average and different comp sets. You can kind of sort and filter for, what's my ad blocking rate versus the ad block rate of publishers my size or on the West Coast, or what's the eCPM, for the mobile platform versus desktop. So that's actually being built, or I think it's almost done. And like I said, it'll be debuted in about a month in New Orleans.
Fantastic. Great question, by the way. Okay. Listen, we're a little bit over, but I just want to take a second to thank Nikhil for the work you've done, and Arvid for developing this system. Thanks to both of you for giving us your time today. Really appreciate that. and for you guys that have stuck with us and attended the webinar today. I do need to tell you that if you have questions that didn't get answered or you didn't get a chance to ask, if you will address those to this email address, webinars@mathereconomics.com. That's webinars@mathereconomics.com. We'll be sure to get you an answer, and just a reminder that you're going to get a copy of this slide deck and the recording for everybody that registered. So thanks, everybody. Really appreciate your time today. Have a great one.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Nikhil.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.